Brown.
Rhodes!
Okay, are we ready to do this? This is episode 6. Welcome to another edition of the Lean Newsroom. Today we're going to talk about journalism as a process or journalism as a service. Historically, if we think about journalism, journalism has always been thought of in the context of the story or the package or something for the evening edition or something for the evening broadcast. And gradually over probably the last decade, there's been a pretty good conversation about, is journalism really this singular unit, this story that we look at, or do we need to really come up with a new frame for discussing what journalism is? And what kind of sparked this hit close to home to me is this is a conversation we've been having in our own communication department, and talking about how do we view our students? Do we view them as video students, or do we view them as print students, or do we view them as multimedia students? And how do we think about them? And how should we be talking to our students in what we do in our program? And ultimately, how does that affect what we do in our classroom? So I thought that might be we were talking about that might be a good place to focus this conversation on. So,
Yeah.
Bram, you were mentioning that you're getting ready to go to you're going to do a panel discussion on this topic.
Yeah, basically, we're going to be talking about journalism as a service and how journalists can use some new digital tools in order to better listen to communities and serve communities, really starting with the audience and their needs or their jobs to be done, before coming up with innovative new products. So I do have a sort of a link to share on that. Oops,
You want me to put it on? I can put it on the screen.
I got it, I think. Oh, wait, nope. Hang on. There it is.
There we go.
Nice.
Yep.
Sorry, that was my first link share. So it's going to be live streamed, too, for people that are not in New York. And we actually have some pretty amazing folks who are going to be on that panel who have some great experience using social media in very creative ways to engage audiences. Amanda Zamora from ProPublica, Zach Seward from Quartz. You can sort of see all the panelists are there on that link. So they're going to talk a little bit about their careers, how they decide to approach journalism in this slightly different way. So I'm hoping it'll be kind of interesting. I'm really looking forward to hearing what these guys have to say. So I hope a lot of people can either come or join us on the live stream.
And that is a great lineup. I like seeing that lineup because one of the things especially when it comes, you think about ProPublica and Quartz and some of these other sites, I think they do a really good job of thinking about journalism non-traditionally, and don't always think in terms of linear narratives, but think in terms of kind of like the conversation that DigiDave, David Cohn talks about, circa the atomized stories. That if we can think in terms of atoms that we put together, I think that's a good way of thinking about how we do our jobs. How do we get the pieces and parts and put those together, and thinking about how we are one part of the storytelling puzzle. That I think historically, when we think of journalism as a story or journalism as a package, the issue that we run into is we are solely responsible for putting it all together. And I think when you start thinking of journalism as a process or a service, what you start thinking about is you are one of many people that are participating in discovering what the overall meaning of this thing is.
Yeah. I think what's cool, too, is that it connects with a lot of other smart ideas about how we can do journalism better in the digital age, if you really think about it. Entrepreneurs always really preach about starting with really understanding who your customers or your potential customers are. Design thinking, step one is empathy, which is basically where you go out and you spend time in a community and you try to understand people's problems from their perspective and their thoughts and feelings about a problem. You know, there's all these, Clayton Christensen, who we've talked about, who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, you know, he talks about what are the jobs to be done. I mean, there's all these threads here, and I don't think they're that different than classic journalism values, in the sense that obviously we always set out to, you know, report on the community and understand it. But I mean, I think historically we've kind of, you know, maybe not done such a good job of that, and reported for our sources and our peers, you know, more than the actual community. So I think there's a lot of threads here that you could tie together on this issue.
You know, that's a really good point about writing for your peers and writing for the sources sometimes, because I think one issue that comes up a lot, especially when it comes to winning journalism awards, you know, there's always there's a lot of emphasis on the scoop, and sometimes I think the scoop is more important to journalists than it necessarily is to the public.
Right.
That I think what we get so focused and hung up on being first, when really your window in today's environment for owning a story like that is pretty limited, you know.
Right.
And actually what you want to do, I was thinking about the way I was consuming stories about Ferguson. I was looking to everybody. I was reading the Washington Post, I was reading the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I was reading Twitter, I was reading Antonio French, I was consuming it all because I couldn't get enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted all these different perspectives to give me the complete, you know, the 360 view. And as one person, you can't get the 360 view, no matter how good of a journalist you are.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I think that's a really excellent point.
Yeah, I think.
Want me to stop sharing this now? Hang on.
Yes, you can
Sure.
hit the stop sharing.
Cool.
So I can see that I'm talking to a person and
I
not
figured out how to do it. Cool. That's fun.
There we go. See, we're experimental journalists that are figuring this thing out.
Yeah.
The
I
other,
mean, one of the classic. Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Just one of the classic examples that what you just said before made me think of that is, I mean, how many times do you still read? I mean, and people like Jay Rosen and others have been talking about this for years now, but I mean, how often do you still read politics coverage that is all horse race? Or you read an article about a city council meeting, and it's all about kind of the politics and the infighting, and this guy said this and this guy said that. Now, that's really interesting for the people on the city council and the people that are very closely involved with that, but like your average person that is not particularly politically engaged, I mean, to them, they're like, what does this mean to me? I mean, nothing, usually. You know, they don't understand, like, how, and it's very relevant to their lives, you know, their future, the city, you don't see that. I mean, there's nothing earth-shattering about that critique, but I think the idea of journalism of service is very fundamentally about, you know, questioning that and realizing, you know, we can do better. We can start by understanding what people want, and then when we go to the city council meeting, you know, we actually can give them what they need to know from that, not just some, like, he said, she said kind of thing, you know?
You know, and I went to lunch today with a good friend of mine who's been a longtime journalist. She's been an education reporter for 15 years. And just today we were talking about just that. And she was talking about how she really wants to change her frame of thinking from education coverage to child and family coverage, and that it shouldn't be about going to the school board meeting and seeing what all the inside baseball is at the school board meeting, but thinking in terms of the decisions that are being made by the school board and how those are impacting children and families and what they're learning in the classroom, and ultimately those outcomes that we see in the schools. And so I think this is not just a conversation, an academic exercise. No. I think journalists are really struggling with this too in the newsrooms, to think about how are we doing things that really matter? How are we doing things that touch people in a way that go beyond just, oh, we've got the story, or oh, we've got this. We're actually, the information that we're providing is helping people. It's providing solutions to our community. And seeing in some ways it kind of connects back to the idea of civic journalism, the notion of even though a lot of journalists initially balked at that, I think it really was an acknowledgement of saying, you know what, we're part of the community, we're not separate from the community.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just talking to somebody about that not that long ago. I mean, it is funny that a lot of these things that we talk about today, I mean, even the concept of engagement, which is so hot right now, I mean, a lot of that is exactly what they talked about with civic journalism. It's just now we have totally new tools and different ways of measuring it. So that kind of, I mean, it does change the ways we do it and the ways we think about it, but like the fundamental concept there is very, it's pretty consistent. I mean, boy, it's been what, 20 years now since civic journalism first kind of got going, maybe even a little bit more, something like that. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I think, and I think in execution sometimes it didn't always work.
No, yeah, definitely.
But in some ways it was experimental. It's what journalism needed to be doing, and experimenting with those and playing with those. And I remember when I first came to Springfield, the editor at the time, Randy Hammer, he was a big civic journalism proponent. Mm-hmm. And I came from a very traditional newsroom when I first started working at Springfield. And I remember the first year really disrupted my thinking as a journalist. I mean, I was really kind of shell-shocked because of the things we were doing. What do you mean we're going to share our news budget with the readers before we've even written the package? Aren't we worried, shouldn't we be controlling that or withholding that? Why are we doing that kind of process when actually it made our journal better? I mean, it was disconcerting for the first few months when I did it, but then it really helped me sort of understand the importance of understanding the community and understanding that we are part of the community, not a part of the community, apart from the community. So right. I think that was really, really important to think about. But
yeah, I mean, there definitely were it ran into some roadblocks. Some of its proponents maybe didn't do as good a job as they could have in terms of the ways in which they presented their ideas. It was also a time before, before our survival anxiety was so high. I mean, newspapers were already facing problems in the 90s, but I mean, nothing like, obviously, what's happened much more recently. So people were not in a mindset where, we have to figure out a way to change. It was very different.
That's very true. Because I was thinking back when I was at the paper, we were still immensely profitable. Mm-hmm. We didn't have to worry so much about. It wasn't so much of whether we're going to be profitable. It was, are we going to make plan or not? That was our concern. It wasn't, are we going to even make money? Mm-hmm. So I think, that's that. Now that it's at a crisis point where you're like, mm-hmm. Are you going to make any money? Are you going to even survive? That forces you to, kind of what we've seen at the Christian Science Monitor, that now with that threat of extinction, people are on board and they're saying, okay, we need to try these things. We need to try doing, instead of doing that one story every 2 days that's a think piece that's 2,000 words long, maybe what we need to do is do those, 3 or 4, 250 to 500 word posts over mm-hmm. They've switched more to that process idea as well, and watching how does the audience engage with that particular story? How does it fit in with the trending topics we're seeing on Google? How does that, and how are we part of that? And how do we tweak our coverage based on what we're seeing from the audience and what we're seeing from the global environment? I think that's a smart way to approach your journalism.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of what we've talked about with CUNY is how, journalism as a service is not always going to mean a traditional narrative. I mean, it might mean sophisticated use of data so that people can really drill down and find out what's happening in their neighborhood. It might mean a really great, interactive graphic. I mean, that doesn't mean that you can't have stories. And I think ProPublica shows how you can do sort of, even though they have great graphics and such, but I mean, they also do some very traditional investigative reporting, and they do some nice, text pieces as well. But I mean, I think, they do such a good job with engagement that, those pieces are successful. So I mean, I think long form is still viable, but it's just that that's not the only go-to option that we have anymore. It's like, what is the best way to deliver this particular story based on readers' needs? And I think, they're getting much better at that.
Yeah, I agree. That is the point, is that it should be one tool in your toolbox, not the only tool. I mean, not
Right.
the only thing that you go to. And hearing you talk about data, there was something that came out earlier this week from the Sunlight Foundation, which gets at some of the things that you're talking about. Net neutrality is one of those, broccoli journalism topics that's like really hard to get into. And what's interesting is how John Oliver was able to crack this and put it on a comedy show and actually move people to action to think about this and comment on it. And then and you can see that in the data, because as they were looking at these internet comments, they talked about how often John Oliver's name comes up in the comments itself. But the other reason why I wanted to highlight this example is this is a great interactive graphic about how you might approach a different story. So you see the online way of telling the story with a list and bullet points and summaries, and then links to other sites and information. But then, not only is this a graphic, it's exploratory. I can click on these different things, these little modules, to see what the words are that are often appearing. They've color coded them for me to make sense out of them, and then I can explore the individual comments. And the best part of this that I love is that you can download the data yourself.
Yeah.
And do your own analysis. So it's that as we've talked in previous episodes, the importance of transparency, of saying, you know what, we have a narrative that we found. We have a story that we found, but maybe you see something different in this data than we've seen. So why don't you do your own analysis and share your own analysis with us? This is one take on it.
Right.
I think that's really critical moving forward for news organizations to understand that they are one voice among many.
Yeah, and I mean also just the idea of in addition to this data you can drill down into what actions could you potentially take? How can we facilitate you being able to organize yourself to take this action? I mean, in the past that was always such dicey territory because it can move into advocacy, but there are definitely ways of kind of getting around that, in which you've talked to people, what they want to do, and now you're providing some tools that will help them do that. And there's a big difference between that and just sort of outright advocacy for something. So and I think a lot of news organizations that are successful are going to move in that direction. Like, here's how you actually have impact on your community.
Yeah. Well, and you do it in such a way, like you said, there's ways to do that without necessarily saying, here's our point of view, or here's what we think you should do. You can, providing links to the pertinent organizations, providing links to charities if you feel moved to donate, if you connecting to legislators if you want to express your viewpoint on that. In this case where we're looking at the FCC, providing a link to how to comment to the FCC, that's empowering people to do something with the information you provided them. You're not necessarily telling them what to say. You're just saying, here's what you can do if you want to say something.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think people understand that if you're very clear that we're not telling you to do this, but here are some options for you if you would like to do something about it. I mean, I think we sometimes can be a little bit patronizing when we think that people can't understand, how different that is from, taking a stand on an issue.
One other thing I wanted to highlight in this discussion, we're talking about allowing people to explore the information that we've gathered, right? So that's one way of approaching this. I think another way in this journalism as a process idea that I really like, we talked a little bit about live blogging last time. One of the organizations that I think does this really well is SCOTUS blog.
Oh, yeah.
And whenever opinions come out, they always do a live blog.
Mm-hmm.
And they just do a wonderful job of linking to disparate sources. And what I like about this is they make it very conversational. You know, the person usually who's in charge of it, they allow people to add their comments. So it's not just a live one-way blog, it's people actually commenting. So look at this. I mean, here's a question. How often does SCOTUS reverse a lower court? Often. If you want more precise details, here's some more statistics. Let me point you to other information. That to me is a real reader or user service when you can do that kind of thing, because then you are it, and I think it helps build credibility because you're really showcasing your knowledge. We forget that sometimes, you know, as journalists, especially beat journalists, you become the expert. You know, you have some expertise, especially if you've been covering it. You know, I think of Nina Totenberg at NPR. I mean, she's been covering the Supreme Court for so many years. She has a lot of expertise that she can, and context that she can bring to her stories that somebody who just started covering the Supreme Court isn't going to have. So, I don't know. I think I think live blogging is a really powerful tool that more organizations ought to be looking at and making it more interactive. Because you see some live blogs, like this one on Mashable during the Emmys, this was not very interactive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were just basically putting the information out there. They would gather some tweets, but it was, you know, for the most part, people weren't asking them questions. They weren't contributing apart from things on Twitter, you know.
Right, yeah.
So I think that's one that maybe that it is a good way to use. You can use Twitter to weave into it. I think that's a good method of doing it. I just like this format on SCOTUS. You know, the SCOTUS blog.
Right, yeah. I think they just do a great job in a lot of ways covering the court. And that's also a great example of just, you know, I mean, obviously really covering a niche, but doing it very, very well.
You know, and that might be a way to close this out. In having that conversation with my friend today, I was thinking, I'm wondering, has the general interest newspaper served its use? Are we now? Is it all about, even on the local level, the specialty publications? So, like, if you look to Texas Tribune's success,
Mm-hmm.
they picked legislative coverage, and they said that's what we're going to focus on. We're not going to do breaking news. We're not going to do any of these other areas. We're going to focus strictly on legislative coverage, and that's what we're going to do. And they've done it very well. And I start wondering, is even on the local level, is that what we're moving toward? Where, you know, now we don't have an entire newsroom dedicated to general news. You're going to see sort of a one-person local education blog. So if I'm interested in education issues in the Springfield area, I'm going to follow this one person who covers that. I mean,
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I do think that may be where things are going, and then maybe what you have then is, you know, instead of a general daily news publication, is you have some good aggregators who then, you know, take all of the different specialties and, you know, try to help you get a little piece from each of them. I mean, you know, I mean, there are, like, Chalkbeat is here in Memphis and a few other cities covering education news. They're doing a fantastic job. You know, I mean, I think they're giving local dailies a run for their money. I mean, maybe there is, you know, maybe you can do a better job really choosing your focus areas. And even most newspapers these days, I mean, given their staff cuts, they've had to kind of focus on certain coverage areas. I mean, they're not doing every single thing that kind of happens in the community the way that they used to. I mean, I think that's just not possible anymore. They're really picking like 3 or 4 areas they're going to flood the zone in, and then everything else they're kind of just letting go because they just have to. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, is going to the aggregated blog model of
Mm-hmm.
that. And to some degree, that's what Forbes has done. You know, Forbes has that, you know, that stable of community bloggers, and HuffPost is that way too. That they've had those people that write in those specialty areas that
Yeah.
aren't necessarily staffers, but they're affiliates and they get paid for that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, the international journalists that have been getting so much attention in Syria and Iraq, and many of them are freelancers. They're not paid staff for these organizations. They're freelance correspondents, and which is kind of a shame because they put their lives at risk and they don't have the support of a major news organization for when something happens to them. So James Foley is risking his life so that we get the story, but he's out there on his own without the kind of support that somebody from the New York Times might have, or the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, no, exactly, definitely.
Oh. Well, so what journalism, one of the things we can do is we can put a couple of links to journalism as a process. I also found the post that Jeff Jarvis wrote a while back in 2009. He was talking about that product versus process journalism, and it's still a really good read. So I would recommend that. So we can post the links to that under the comments for this particular episode. So thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week, same time, 2 o'clock Thursday, and perhaps next week we could talk about engagement. We could dig a little bit more into the changing conversation on engagement. I noticed that was on a Twitter chat. That was the subject of the Twitter chat that was hosted a while back. I saw that. So so thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.